Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Happy Thursday. This is the CTD webinar series and today's presentation on the 2020 Washington State Forest Action Plan with our guest speaker, Andrew Spaeth. My name is Jan Thomas. I'm a member of the Center for Technical Development, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. CTD hosts this webinar series on the third Thursday of each month, and we have a really wide variety of topics. You can find all of the upcoming webinars on the CTD website, as well as the recordings of past webinars. This webinar is also being recorded, and so if you want to check back on it, or if you had a friend that wasn't able to make it, you can find those recordings on the website. Also, if you have an idea for a webinar, or a project to share, we would love to hear from you. You can just send me an email at training@wact.org, and we can start that conversation and get your idea or project featured on our webinar series. Just going to run through the basic logistics as we get started. We are in webinar mode, so as attendees, you are all muted. But we do want to make this as interactive as possible with question and answers. We're going to take several pauses throughout the presentation for questions. So if you have a question, you can type it into the questions box and I can read it out for you, or you can use that raise your hand icon and I can unmute you and then you'll be able to ask your question directly. Keeping in mind you'll have to unmute yourself as well if you want to speak. And then one last thing to mention, we're going to start off with a couple of short poll questions here at the beginning of the presentation to help Andrew get kind of a better sense of who's on the line with us today. So when you see those poll questions pop up in just a minute here, select your answer and we'll go through each question and then we'll display the results once everyone's had a chance to respond. If you're having any issues with your audio or visual this morning, you can try to type that into the questions box as well, and I'll help you try to troubleshoot as best I can. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll introduce our speaker today, Andrew Spaeth with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And Andrew, I'm going to turn the screen over to you. And I'm going to put up our first poll as well while Andrew gets started here and introduces himself.
Thanks so much, Jan. Good morning, everybody. All right, it looks like the poll is open. Will folks be able to see that on their screens now, Jan? I'm not seeing it. Doesn't mean others might not be.
Yep, I'm hoping that everyone can see that quick poll. Yeah, you and I don't have quite the same view as the attendees there, but folks, if you could go ahead and cast your vote there. We're asking a question, are you familiar with the Forest Action Plan? And let's see, we've got most of our votes in here, I think. So I will close this one. So, sorry, it's a little clunky. So we have most people here have heard of it, but not many that are very familiar. Can you see those results, Andrew?
I'm not seeing that, no.
Okay, I'll read them out to you. So everyone's at least heard of it. Most people have heard of it, but just a few people saying I'm very familiar with it. And
great, thanks.
Our next poll here, is forestry identified as a priority in your conservation district's long-range plans? And our options here, yes, no, not sure. We'll just give folks a second here to cast their votes. Okay. Yeah, it looks like the majority here, 90% are saying yes, it is identified as a priority, and just about 10% with a no, not identified as a priority.
Great.
And the last question, we're just wondering our distribution throughout the state today. So what part of the state do you serve? Puget Sound, Southwest, Central, or Eastern? And our votes here. Couple more seconds. Okay, looks like we're at 55% Puget Sound, 18% Southwest, and 27% Central, and no Eastern.
Okay,
so,
great. That's helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so that's done with the polls. Thank you for participating there, and I'll let Andrew take it away.
Thanks, Jan. Are you able to see my first slide?
Yep, looking good.
Wonderful. And I'm going to try to turn on my webcam. If I have bandwidth issues, you can let me know if it's getting clunky and you're not seeing my slideshow anymore, probably here.
Thank you. Let's see.
We'll just do this. Is that working now?
Yeah, now we've got your slideshow back. I'm not seeing your webcam, but we do have your slideshow up.
Okay, that's fine. We'll go with this. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Spaeth. I'm an environmental planner in the Forest Health and Resiliency Division at the Washington Department of Natural Resources. I joined the department about a year and a half ago to help the state update our state forest action plan. For those of you who worked with the Department of Natural Resources and are familiar with the organization, you may know that the Forest Health and Resiliency Division is actually a new division, the newest division within the agency. We used to be part of the Wildfire Division, but a couple of years ago were created as a new part of the agency. We house a couple of critical aspects of the forest health related initiatives and work that the state's involved in. We have a program that is engaged in community and landowner assistance. So that includes the Forest Stewardship Program. So those of you who interact with Ken Bevis or Matt Provencher, Rob Lineberger, those folks sit in that part of our shop. We have a prescribed fire program, which is leading efforts associated with increasing the use of prescribed fire as a forest health and management tool across the state. We have the federal lands program. So those of you who work with National Forest System partners may be familiar with our Good Neighbor Authority, the ability of the state to partner and work with the Forest Service to implement projects on federal lands. So that's a part of our program and our Forest Health Resiliency Division. And then finally, we have a planning, science, and monitoring team, and that's the shop that I sit in. And we're focused on long-range strategic planning, implementation planning associated with our priority landscapes, as well as the science and monitoring efforts in our support, the implementation of the work, prioritization of activities, and adaptive management. So I've got about 23 or so slides for you today. The purpose of the presentation is to give you an overview of the 2020 Forest Action Plan. I'm going to start by sharing some context to help those of you who maybe are familiar with the plan, make sure everybody's on the same page and understands why the state develops this plan and kind of the primary purposes that it serves and the unique approach that Washington took. I'm going to share with you an overview of some of the key things that we learned through an assessment associated with this strategic plan. I'm also going to talk through some of the key goals and priority actions that we committed to as a state that I think are most relevant and connected to the important work of conservation districts. And then finally, I'm going to walk through some of the prioritization processes that we used and our science team and other partners contributed to help us identify priority landscapes, in which we're going to focus a lot of our forest health and resiliency work over the next 5 years. All right. So I tried to go to the next slide. Jan, did that work?
I don't see it. Just still looking at the title slide here.
Okay.
There we go. That's what...
Okay. All right. This is a little bit of a lag, but great. So this is the cover of our 2020 Forest Action Plan, and one of the key definitions that we identify and define here is forest health. And so this builds on the previous RCW, and I think is really inclusive of the broad range of kind of ecological, economic, and social related interests that we have associated with forest health and forest management. And this is how the Forest Health and Resiliency Division and our state's defining this in the context of this plan. Forest action plans first came about in the 2008 Farm Bill. The federal government for a long time has been partnering with states to implement and help administer what they call cooperative forestry programs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. So these 8 cooperative forestry programs are funded through USDA Forest Service and administered by the state of Washington. And in the 2008 Farm Bill, Congress said, we're really happy about this partnership, but we'd like to understand the context. We'd like to understand what the strategy is that you're using to help inform and guide the implementation of these programs and the investments that we're making in your state. And so states were required to develop their first forest action plans in 2010, and then updated. They're reviewed every 5 years, and updates are made every 5 years, and then you're required to do a full revision every 10 years. So we hit that 10-year mark, and that's why we published this 2020 Forest Action Plan when we did. It is a requirement and allows us to continue to maintain access to these critical sources of funding for these great programs. The amount of funding that the state receives for these programs varies, in part based on congressional appropriations and the equations that USDA develops to determine how much each state will receive. Some of these programs are also nationally competitive grant programs that Washington applies for against, relative to other states, and receives funds based on the competitiveness of our proposals. On average, over the last 10 years, we've received anywhere between about $6.5 and $13.5 million in any given year to support this work. So I'm going to quickly walk through, and I don't think any of this will be surprising for the natural resource professionals on the line and those of you who work in conservation districts, but summarize some of the things that are included in the assessment section of our document. So this is a high-level assessment of the conditions of forest ecosystems in the state of Washington, and a description of what the Forest Action Plan kind of lingo refers to as threats facing forests. So sure, these primary threats that I've indicated here, and really some opportunities obviously as well, are all too familiar to you and the work that you do on the ground. So in our assessment, that climate change is obviously increasing the risk of prolonged drought in all of our forest ecosystems across the state. This has probably been most widely recognized some of our eastern, dry forest ecosystems, but really a drought has the potential to be especially impactful in Western Washington, where we have fewer drought-tolerant species. Our forest health folks are already seeing, and I'm sure you're seeing some of this as well, impacts on species like western red cedar and bigleaf maple. And we know that those impacts are going to be especially hard on our simplified forests. So some of the best tools that we have to prepare our forests for drought are density management, diversification, favoring drought-tolerant species, replanting with hardwoods, increasing the use of prescribed fire to manage small fuels, and focusing our treatments on soil types and aspects that are likely to be most affected by moisture stress. Insect disease outbreaks are often tied and are becoming more intense and severe in recent years. Between 2015 and 2019, the number of acres affected by insect disease outbreaks nearly doubled, with more than 650,000 acres impacted. Our forest health scientists have identified bark beetles, Balsam adelgid, aspen leaf miner, spruce aphid, and Douglas fir tusk moth as some of the most pressing and important emerging insect disease risks in the state. Wildfires, no surprise, are becoming larger and more severe, including in Western Washington. And scientists point out that the proximity of values at risk, so our homes and infrastructure and drinking water source areas, to forests, especially in Western Washington, means that a continued policy of aggressive detection and suppression is really critical to reducing risks and potential losses. Portions of Western Washington were identified in some of the analysis we conducted associated with this report, including East Jefferson County, Whidbey Island, Fidalgo, parts of the San Juans, and other unique habitat types such as forested balds, jerry oak systems, prairies. Those should really be our highest priority for fuels reduction on the west side. I think there's still a lot more to learn, and really there's more conversations to be had about the role of landscape scale treatments for fuels reduction and wildfire in Western Washington, and whether or not that's really an appropriate strategy. And also, what are the best strategies to protect those values at risk and our communities in light of the fact that we're likely going to be experiencing more fires in Western Washington in the future. On the east side of the Cascades, somewhat different story, right? Those landscape scale forest health treatments are going to be critical to reducing the intensity and severity of wildfires. And that strategy, combined with community level planning, defensible space work around homes, is really kind of that full picture, best approach, kind of both the landscape scale level and community level treatments to prepare our forests and our towns for a future with more wildfire. According to the Washington State Invasive Species Counts, invasive species have an estimated economic impact of $297 million on the timber sector. Himalayan blackberry, Scotch broom, English ivy, I think we're all familiar with these, and they're obviously some of the most pervasive and costly. DNR's role in addressing these as a land manager is obviously critical. We also want to better understand, and it became clear in the assessment, that there's a need for more coordinated detection, monitoring, and treatment work. And I think there's some energy and excitement at the department to think about how we could play a stronger and more supportive role in enabling important work related to addressing the spread of invasives in the state. Between 1978 and 2001, the state lost 1.4 million acres of forest land to development, and estimates since then suggest that we're losing up to 1% of our private forest land annually. The loss of working forests is obviously resulting in significant impacts to our timber resources, water quality and quantity, habitat-related values, and it makes it harder to manage adjacent lands for the purposes of timber production and active forest management, weed control, all the other things that are that land managers do. based on population estimates from the state, we're anticipating the highest risk counties will continue to be Clark, King, Pierce, Snohomish, Thurston, Kittitas, Spokane, and Stevens counties for conversion risk into the future. So that was an overview of some of the key aspects of the assessment section of the report. For those of you who want to dig in and get into the weeds, there's 1 to 2 page vignettes kind of summarizing some of the most relevant and recent science on each of those threats facing forest issues, kind of threats, opportunities as we frame it in the document. And that's available on our website, and I'll post the link in the chat so folks can find that if they're interested. Next, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do, right? So there's big challenges that we face as a state in terms of the future of our forest ecosystems and all the benefits they provide. And how can we, as a state and collectively, begin to address some of those threats at a meaningful scale and in the right places at the right times to make a real difference? And so the strategies section of our report summarizes 8 themes. There are approximately 2 to 4 goals under each of those themes, and there are a total of 109 priority actions that we commit to as a state to address those threats facing forests. And again, I'm just going to highlight, I don't want to walk through all of the 109 priority actions with you today, but I would like to highlight some of those that I think are most relevant to our partnership with conservation districts and the important work that you all do. So under the theme of resilience and within the context of landscape resilience in west of the Cascade Crest, we are really interested in crafting and working with partners to better define what we mean by forest health and resilience and what strategies we want to deploy to address the threats facing forests, especially on the west side of the state. On the east side of the state, some of you probably know we have our 20-year forest health strategic plan, which really guides our efforts associated with forest health and wildfire risk reduction. We obviously on the east side have had a much longer history and a much more frequent fire activity that's helped, I think, provide the impetus to for people to work together and coordinate and collaborate around forest health treatments. And we struggle, I think, on the west side to have that same kind of clear guiding disturbance agent that we are responding to, because the fire return intervals are 2, 4, 500 years, not 5 or 10 years. And we also have a lot different we have a much different forested landscape in terms of the socio-political and economic landscape. So all that is to say is that we're interested in working with partners to figure out what is that vision and what is that strategy for Western Washington, and how can we bring people together around some of these threats that all of our forests are facing to advance important and good work. The other thing, and I alluded to this earlier on the wildfire slide, is that especially in light of what happened in Western Oregon this year, I think there's a real need to better understand how we prepare for these kind of large and historic type of events that may be becoming more common in the future, the Labor Day type events. But we're also interested, I think, in understanding what is the role of active forest management in preparing our landscapes for a future that is likely to be a lot drier and warmer and going to be experiencing more fire. What are the appropriate strategies to preparing the landscape for climate change? We have a number of priority actions in our forest action plan that are drawn from our DNR strategic plan, our 10-year wildland fire protection strategic plan, our DNR plan for climate resilience, our forest health strategic plan. Those are the reference strategies that are kind of thumbnailed on the right-hand side of this slide. A couple that I think are really provide pretty exciting opportunities to continue to partner and work with our conservation districts is around engaging the public and private landowners about what it means to live in the wildland-urban interface, and how we can best prepare our properties and homes for future fire events. There's also the other one that I'd really highlight here, and that we continue to hear a strong interest in, is around the development and updating, integrating community wildfire protection plans into some of these other opportunities. The CWPPs are often a critical step in ensuring that our communities are able to access state and federal resources and different grant programs. They identify important local priorities related to wildfire preparedness. And we know that many of them need to be updated, and I think want to play a supportive and enabling role in providing resources and to do that. Talk briefly about the risk of conversion. We know that small forest landowners who have access to technical assistance, whether it's through a conservation district, WSU extension education programs, our small forest landowner office, that those small forest landowners are less likely to convert their properties into non-forest uses. We're interested in working with conservation districts to really help ensure that every small forest landowner in the state who calls you or calls us or somebody else, that they can get access to the technical assistance and support they need, and that we can help provide them with access to the right information or the right types of cost share support, whether it's NRCS on the west side or our landowner assistance cost share programs on the east side of the state. We also know that a lot of our small forest landowners manage for values other than just timber production. In fact, the vast majority of them manage for things like wildlife habitat and water quality and privacy. And so we want to continue to grow and expand programs that support small private landowners who are interested in committing to continuing to provide those values into the future, and also help them think about ways to identify new streams of revenue, such as carbon or other incentive programs that can support the important contribution that they're making to the overall health of the landscape. One of the really, I think, important opportunities in front of us as a state, and I think this ties back to the conversations about conversion risk, but also rural economic development and thinking about landscape and forest resilience within the context of our economies and the livelihoods and the well-being of our people. Respecting the management responsibilities of all of our partners, respecting the role of working forests in providing timber products, and understanding how that fits into the picture. I think some of our partners at times feel villainized for active management, and I think we want to create and foster a culture that understands, appreciates, and respects the different roles that land managers play, and the benefits associated with different types of management across those different ownerships. But building on that, rural economic development is one of our key themes in this forest action plan, and I think a couple of obviously really important opportunities are implementing our forest restoration strategies in a way that helps maintain and attract that critical infrastructure that's so important to the economic viability of forest restoration treatments. and providing a reliable supply of timber to help ensure that we maintain that infrastructure over time. So the last handful of slides I've got here for you are focused on some of the prioritization work and the identification of priority landscapes that we'll be focused on for at least the next 5 years. I'm going to start by sharing some of the work in Eastern Washington. I know we have some folks from Central, which this will be relevant to, but not anybody from the East Side. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, and I think for those of you who are in Central, hopefully you've heard of our 20-year Forest Health Strategic Plan. You're aware of the landscape prioritization processes, the landscape evaluations that our science team conducts, and some of the implementation planning and investments that the state is making in accelerating outcomes in these places. We did recommit to our Eastern Washington priority landscapes that were identified in the 20-year plan in our 2020 Forest Action Plan. So the state is required to identify priority landscapes as part of our Forest Action Plan, and we're able to identify up to 50% of all forested areas. This is a relatively new development in the forest action planning process, and it's somewhat specific to just a few of the cooperative forestry programs. But in any case, the feds for a long time just gave the states money and allowed us to implement that work and spend federal funds kind of wherever the opportunity was. And I think that what that resulted in is probably a lot of good projects being implemented, but it was somewhat of a kind of a random acts of conservation approach, whereby there wasn't a really overarching kind of strategy or focus on specific landscapes. And we know, especially in the face of climate change and these, the impacts that we're seeing from drought, that you really have to focus and treat a larger portion of the landscape in order to get to that more kind of healthy and resilient condition, and do work across boundaries. On the east side of the state, our forest health scientists conduct landscape evaluations, and on average, they're finding that at least on the east side, we need to be treating about 30 to 40% of each of these priority landscapes in order to shift them from a likely scenario of current condition as high severity fire, large die-offs associated with drought and insect and disease outbreaks. 30-40% treatment will result in that landscape being much better prepared for the impacts of drought, and much more vigorous trees that can withstand insect disease, and in a condition under which we're not going to have high severity, large wildfire events. In Western Washington, we didn't have that same, we have different forest types, and we didn't have that same kind of framework to be able to focus our work around priority landscapes. And so we, as part of this Forest Action Plan revision process, established a technical panel that includes all of the folks that are listed on the slide here, scientists from each of those respective organizations. And the first thing that they did is, helped us figure out what's the question we're actually trying to answer here with this assessment and this analysis. If you're identifying priority landscapes, what are we identifying them for? And the question in the kind of brown here is the guiding question that we use to help us evaluate different data sets that we wanted to include in this analysis, and how we wanted to frame ultimately how we think this information should be used. So it's where will active management, coordinated planning, implementation, and focused investments lead to improved conditions over time? And so we had identified a suite of forest health and resilience indicators for Western Washington, identified a suite of values at risk that are all kind of summarized here, that the data piece on the bottom I'm happy to kind of describe in more detail if folks have questions about those data, what they are. We summarized that at the HUC-5 watershed scale, and then overlaid those different data sets in a pretty straightforward kind of GIS analysis to look at where do we have relatively more of these health and resilience indicators, and where does that overlap with where we have a relatively high amount of values at risk. And so this is the map that came from that came out of that GIS kind of science-based analysis. And so it shows the darker colored areas in kind of the purplish and blue colors being the high priority areas. The green represents kind of the medium priority areas, and then the beige and yellow represents what would be lower priority areas. We didn't necessarily just want to circle all of the areas that came out as a high priority in our analysis. And the reason for that is because we really wanted to, as best as we could, account for opportunities to align our work with existing investments that the Forest Service, state partners, or others have already been making in these places. And we wanted to identify places where we knew there was some alignment of resources, collaborative support, social support to do work and to focus on forest health and resilience type activities. So through that kind of outreach that we conducted associated with this, we started to draw some lines on the map, and in total identified these 16 priority landscapes that collectively cover nearly 2 million acres across the state. You'll notice that we did not cover some of the watersheds in the lower portions of Puget Sound. And so as part of this analysis, we masked out areas that were more than 50% developed. So if the land cover data for a particular HUC showed that more than 50% of it, should say less than 50% was in forested cover, we included it in a prioritization for our urban and communities forestry program, but did not include it in kind of this landscape scale Western Washington prairie landscapes assessment. So there's a section of the document focused on urban and community forestry programs that we have at the department and that USDA Forest Service supports. And you'll see many of these areas in Puget Sound pop out in that analysis because it's really a different set of kind of challenges and opportunities and a different set of data that we wanted to use to highlight the needs and the opportunities for our programs and our state and federal investments to do good work there. I'm just going to walk through a couple of the priority landscapes, one for each of our West Side DNR regions, to talk a little bit about some of what we learned through our outreach and why these places were ultimately selected for these programs. So in the case of, in South Puget Sound region, one of our prairie landscapes is called Snow Quera. This has been the focus of a pretty large scale forest health and restoration project on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. They recently released a decision that covers more than 90,000 acres within this planning area. It includes active management, plantation thinning, trail rehabilitation, road work, all sorts of cool stuff. And so this is a really important landscape to support our partnership between the Department of Natural Resources and the Forest Service. We have partners such as the National Forest Foundation and a group called Blue Forest Conservation that are going to be bringing conservation finance as a tool to help accelerate the implementation of work in this place. Really kind of cool pilot opportunity to bring some lessons learned from California to an important landscape in Western Washington. It's also a really high priority for some of the human components of our landscapes. And this area obviously provides drinking water source area to lots of Washingtonians. It's an important area for recreation, and the lower portions of the watershed especially are really at high risk of conversion. So lots of kind of unique and exciting partnerships that already existed in this landscape, and a number of shovel-ready projects that will help us focus immediately on implementation of good work here. Moving west, another priority landscape in our Olympic region is called Wainuchi, Grays Harbor. So this is a big focus of our partners on the Olympic National Forest and the Olympic Forest Collaborative. They recently signed a decision that includes over 5,000 acres of forest health treatments and about 120 miles of road repair, decommissioning, and maintenance work. Our partners at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife have also identified a number of projects in this priority landscape that are high priority for forest health treatments, and that require some partnerships with neighboring landowners in order to implement. And so we're excited to work with WDFW and some of the other adjacent landowners to figure out how to make those projects happen. This has also been a focus of the Coast Salmon Partnership. They've been conducting some analyses of high priority areas for fish passage barrier removal, and we're excited to work with, I think WDFW is one of the partners, Grays Harbor Conservation District, I think is one of the partners, RCO, to think about ways within this priority landscape to help prioritize funding and removal of a replacement of some of those fish passage barriers through either our Family Forest Fish Passage Program, triple FPP, as you may have heard it, or some of the other state and federal programs that we administer. Moving northwest region, one of our priority landscapes is called Islands, and so it encompasses essentially all of the San Juans as well as Whidbey Island. And so this was identified as a priority for forest health treatments in our partnership with our sister state agencies. Both the BDFW and state parks have identified numerous projects, many that have unique habitat types. And in the scientific analysis, the reason why the San Juans really popped in particular is because of the likely impacts of climate change and drought on that landscape. And so there's really, I think, an exciting opportunity and connection to that work. We also recently submitted a landscape scale restoration and LSR grant that was awarded. So there's a number of years of project funding associated with that effort that we think by identifying this as a prairie landscape, we can really build on and hopefully leverage additional resources to support some great work around biomass utilization, the economics of those forest health projects, which is often challenging, and some of these, many of these islands, and also supporting some community wildfire preparedness activities as well. There's also some really cool work going on Whidbey, utilizing partnerships with like the Department of Defense, other funding sources to support conservation of working lands and creation of some kind of preservation of some lands, and then also really great partnerships around oak restoration, which we hope to continue to be able to really highlight and support through identifying this as one of our priority landscapes. Finally, closer to Jan and I's neck of the woods, Wind River is one of our priority planning areas. This is an area that's been highlighted by the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest as one of their priority landscapes for work. They've got about 4,500 acres of thinning and early cereal habitat creation that they've identified in this project. And it's really unique early cereal habitat creation project, both in terms of its size and also the fact that it's one of the first that's being conducted on National Forest System lands with the explicit purpose of creating early cereal habitat, to our knowledge, on National Forest System lands in a long time. So we're really excited to learn from that and to help focus on that in this priority landscape and share some of that learning with other forest collaboratives and other partners in different parts of the state. There's also some biomass utilization work going on in the Stabler area, development of a utilization campus that we're interested in learning more about and supporting as part of this effort. So those are some of the, obviously not comprehensive. I didn't cover all 16 of our priority watersheds, but try to give you a sense of some of the what we learned through that outreach and some of the reasons why we identified these as priority landscapes and some of the things we're interested in focusing on through the Forest Health and Resiliency Division and the implementation of this Forest Action Plan. The last thing I wanted to mention here is somewhat of a new thing for implementation strategy for this Forest Action Plan. There's a lot of work to do. There's numerous partners. There's so many opportunities in each of these landscapes. And so we're taking a hard look to think about within all of these the important activities. First of all, who's already doing what? Second of all, kind of who's on point at the department to be the main liaison or point of contact to our partners in that priority landscape and for the goals and priority actions that we've committed to. And then finally, really to commit to that adaptive management process, to monitoring and to publishing an annual progress report, which will help us hold ourselves accountable and be accountable to the public and our partners, that describes what we've accomplished, what some of the gaps are, and hopefully also sets us up for additional future capital budget requests or other federal grants or federal funding that we want to go after. So with that, I am going to stop talking. Hopefully there are some questions or comments or feedback. Jan, do you
thank you,
have any
Andrew.
questions?
I don't see any questions yet in the box there, but folks, if you just want to type in your question, I'd be happy to read it out to Andrew, or if you just want to use that raise your hand function, also a good option if you just want to ask your question directly. I do have one question just popped in here. Is anything going on in the Nooksack priority watershed?
Yeah, I'll cruise back here to the overview of all the priority landscapes, so folks who want to see what that looks like. Yeah, so the Nooksack is an area that's also a real focus for our Forest Service partners on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie. There's the second early cereal habitat creation project that's being planned on a national forest in Western Washington is going to be planned there. Because of the fire season, I think the feds may have been delayed in kicking off that planning process, but our understanding is they're still committed to doing that work, and we're excited to see how they learn from and adapt some of what was done in the Wind River Prairie area and apply it there. I think a small portion of that Nooksack area was also identified as a priority by our forest stewardship program. I think there have been some landowners that have reached out, and there's an expressed interest among some of those folks on the kind of the public-private land interface in supporting some of the active management, restoration, forest health related goals that they have there. So those are a couple of the things that I'm aware of right now in the Nooksack. And all of you probably have other local knowledge and information about what's going on in some of these places. And part of what I'm really interested in is making connections with all of you so you can help me fill in my gaps in knowledge and help us as a state think about what are some of those strategic opportunities to invest in forest health and support our partnership with conservation districts, and ultimately support good work on the ground with all of you into the future.
So. Bill, you have your hand up. I'm going to unmute you, and you should be able to. Yep, we hear you now.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Hey, yeah, thanks. Very good presentation. That was awesome. I'm curious. I manage the Skagit Conservation District, and then we also coordinate our Firewise program between Whatcom, Skagit, and willing to help our neighbors, around Whidbey, San Juan, and south of the Snohomish. So I'm curious with the potential for some HEALS Act funding to actually get some money done on the ground in some of our treatments and things like that, and community outreach events over the next couple of years. Do you think, are we working on a quick method, or the process how we can distribute funding if it comes around to support stuff? Not a one size fits all, obviously, because our programs and needs are different around the area between conservation districts and the regional DNR offices. But just curious if we could start thinking about how, if that money gets plopped in our lap to go do our kind of work, how best we distribute that easily and not spend 9 months trying to figure out how to get the money spent on the ground. So just curious if that's in discussions.
Yeah, and Bill, do you work with Jenny Coe? Is she?
Yep. She's on the. I see she was on here. So yep, she works.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah. She on here too. Yeah, she helped provide some input during the Forest Action Plan process as well, and I learned a lot about some of the cool stuff that's going on in your neck of the woods, the good CWP update. So I guess I think the gist of your question is, how do we get dollars to the ground more quickly when they become available? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, and how I might be able to help. I also chair the Puget Sound Caucus, so all 12 conservation districts, and so I'm just thinking big picture. How do we get that done ahead of time, or start getting the right people talking, so we don't wish we had that all figured out when it actually is there. So again, whether it be the actual treatment work or the outreach work, that fits right in each of our areas and the regions around wherever it may be, because we don't. That's my gist.
So yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, and we've had a couple of years with our 20-year forest health strategic plan in Eastern Washington to really begin to, I think, get a better handle on that question, and so I'll share some just anecdotally what I think we've learned there, and some of the new tools we're putting into place. So the 20-year plan dates back to 2017, so we're 4 years in or whatever now. And what we've done is, even so, before we've received our capital appropriations, we've begun working internally with our contracting staff to build out the RFA, the request for applications, or the RFP, the request for proposals, get all the language figured out, kind of understand what the requirements are going to be, when we're going to run the application process, how we're going to evaluate applications. And then on July 1, basically the first day of the fiscal year, we are putting ourselves in a position to be able to start getting contracts out the door and making awards. So for one of the grant programs that I'm involved in on the east side, we're soliciting applications from our federal partners and forest collaborative partners right now. We've got a pre-application review process that's being conducted this week. Applications are going to be finalized in the next month and reviewed internally. And then again, so by the first day of the fiscal year, we're going to hopefully have, contracts out the door for signature, and we're going to give our partners as much time as possible, within that fiscal year, to implement the activities that they committed to. I think that's by doing that, we're really doing that planning work ahead of time and helping to create the enabling conditions to be successful. I think it takes a little bit of time for us internally to get our systems in place, to get our all of the right folks at DNR and our contracting folks and administrators to understand why we're doing that, even though we don't have an approved budget, and how that's going to help us and our partners implement this work and be more successful. I think the other thing that we've been thinking about at a statewide level is, when wildfire season hits, we tend to get this kind of outpouring of interest from landowners and partners about, what do I need to do? It's like winter comes and goes, and we don't always get a lot done. And then we kind of get to that early part of fire season, and the hardest fire season, all of our resources are deployed, and we maybe not at the agency, we don't have as much capacity as we'd like to be responsive to that interest that we're hearing from the public. So how could we work with conservation districts to set up some partnerships, set up some mechanisms at the statewide level to share resources in a way that really enables us to be much more responsive and kind of, strike while the iron's hot. So I think some of those same types of kind of opportunities and efficiencies that I described on the east side are absolutely possible on the west side. And I think to your point, it's what I guess I would just offer based on what I learned through this forest action plan process is that there are so many different partners, and there's that there's a lot of funding available. It's about it's really figuring out, like you said, how do you get the right people in the room at the right time, figure out what our shared priorities are and who's kind of doing what, and how to leverage those partnerships to kind of get the most bang for your buck. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know or haven't thought of. Obviously, it's just it seems to me like DNR can play an enabling or supporting role to some extent, but it's really it's partners on the ground. It's the local folks like you and others that are going to be able to facilitate making that happen. And I think we're open to feedback too about what role you think we could play, or how other ideas about how you think we could be more helpful in that regard.
I think that's awesome. I think since you already have a good model on the east side, we might as well just sort of say, okay, here we have a good example. Let's try it over on the west side and adapt to make it fit. Because I think we'll be raring to go. To help out. So it's sort of just that. That's exactly it. How do we get that all lined up ahead of time so we're not chasing our trail trying to rush it? So okay, no, I like that. Sounds like we got a good example, so appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And if I might ask you, so how are you kind of thinking about, what we're really grappling with in these west side priority areas is that, again, we don't have wildfire as that primary disturbance agent in every one of these landscapes that brings folks together and says, here's our need for action, right? And in most cases, it's a combination of conversion risk, wildfire threat, it's water, it's salmon recovery, it's wildlife habitat connectivity, right? There's just like this broader and more diverse suite of issues, and that makes it more complicated in terms of the number of partners that are ultimately going to be involved, the potential funding sources that might be available to support the work. Like, how are you prioritizing or grappling with some of those different opportunities or challenges and prioritizing those within the work of your district?
Well, I think because we did just update our coordinated wildfire protection plan. So in our area, it would be, okay, here's the plan. Here's these communities at most risk. based on our, the most recent analysis using the soils and all the other things, which I think you probably saw. And so that we would go out and do that, and then reach out to those communities that aren't yet involved. So that would be dollars to set up for Jenny to go out and start working with those communities. But then I think around Puget Sound, though, then like you mentioned, there's others that don't have their CWPP yet. So you can have mutual priorities within those areas, depending on how far off they are. Okay, if there's nothing, definitely that should be a priority. Versus us, we're in the middle of implementation, so you split it a little bit up with implementation and or preparedness and planning. And so I think, and around the caucus, we could have a discussion about this on our agenda, I think, and just see where everybody's at around those 12 Puget Sound districts to get an idea of where those. I mean, you've already done the work, but I mean, again, just to talk about it and see when it comes to what might they need if we're trying to set up the funding mechanism as has been done in Eastern Washington, and how to distribute it where and when, and wherever there's room to, like Jenny can cover bigger areas, if the funding, because we live off billable hours, off different pots of money all around conservation district world. And so, but I think and we sit on they sit on the Salmon Recovery Council, the caucus does. So when it ties to salmon recovery too, I think we're aware of some of those different needs that might be in different spots, and can make sure and plug in and support those where the multiple benefits are the greatest. We do that, but and also then protection. I guess a question I have in forest land protection and conversion, is it to protect those most at risk, or to protect those that are for certainly not at risk, to make sure that all of a sudden doesn't start getting into UG8 or whatever? Because it's the same in salmon recovery. Do you protect what's already protected by regulations, or or the most at risk? So I'm not quite sure how that one's going to work with the conversion.
Yeah, I think there's some more work around conversion to better understand kind of the trade-offs associated with, the two strategies, if you want to call them that you just described, because there's obviously some real differences in the amount of money you're going to need to protect some of those areas that are most at risk, and maintaining them as working forests if they're in the middle of a development is probably not practical in the long run. And so what are the other tools or mechanisms that we have to put them in a conservation status that's going to be a good fit for the realities of where they sit within a landscape. So
thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Bill.
Thanks, guys. I have a couple of questions in here that kind of relate to that connections and coordinating piece that you guys are just discussing. So what is the best way to engage DNR staff to help develop forest action projects, especially in priority areas that don't appear to have a lot of activity? And then kind of another question along those lines, should we reach out to Andrew directly to make connections with work planned in nearby priority watersheds?
I would, depending on, use the relationships that you already have would be my advice. All of our regions, our DNR region staff, at least the leadership of each of the regions has received presentations about the forest action plan. They provided input through the development process. They helped us identify these priority landscapes. So the region staff is a great place to start, and they'll, I think they can help kind of getting on the same page with them, helping them understand your interests or needs, where there's alignment with what their programs or priorities are, I think is all really helpful. Certainly as I think about the important work around small forest landowners, particular connections to, on the west side, Matt Venture, Ken Bevis and Rob Lineberger in our forest stewardship program. On the east side, I think those, Matt, Rob, Ken are all really familiar with the forest action plan and are good points of connection to have if that's the focus of the outreach or the work. And then, I would love to know what's going on and what your priorities are. That helps me, continue to kind of build out the list of opportunities in these priority areas, and again helps us think about within the division how we're prioritizing capital budget requests and focusing our federal grant requests in a way that aligns with the local priorities that you've identified in these places. So I'd love to be in the loop, and I'm happy to share my contact information again if you don't already have it, so that you can just call me or email me directly.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, if you had a slide with that stuff, maybe we could just put that up for folks now. And then if there's any other questions, again, type them into the questions box, or you can just raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask directly if that's easier. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else coming into the questions box now, or hands raised. So if you have any final questions or thoughts or comments for Andrew, go ahead and put them in there now. Let's see.
Jen, I'm seeing on my thing that somebody, so it looks like maybe Chris Elder had a question, and maybe Jenny Coe had a question, but I could be wrong about that. It might just be something I'm seeing on my side.
Yeah, no, they both did, and that's what I was just asking you about. Their questions were how best to engage with DNR and
okay.
how to reach out.
Got it. Sorry. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm gonna just a kind of a logistical thing. I don't think our attendees here can see that chat box that you and I are using, so I'm going to answer Jenny's question here with Andrew's email address. So hopefully you can all see that. And then, of course, this presentation and Andrew's contact information will also be posted on the CTD website, along with a link to this forest plan, so you can look at it in more detail if you wanted to. But I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this morning. Andrew, thank you so much for being here and sharing this with us. And I'm sure you'll get some follow-up from our attendees here. So appreciate that, and appreciate all of your time this morning with us. And we will see you at the next CTD webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen.